Welcome to the Pre to Post Transplant Podcast, a podcast that brings personal stories from transplant survivors, their families, friends, and loved ones. This is where you will hear challenges and triumphs of everyone involved in this journey. Our guests will offer wisdom, advice, and inspiration on everything you want to know about transplant. My name is Jenny McFarland. I am a transplant survivor, and this is a podcast I wish I had before and immediately following my transplant. Thank you for listening. Hey everybody, welcome back to the podcast. This is Jenny McFarland, your host. So, how was your Thanksgiving? It is the week after Thanksgiving, if you're listening to this in real time. And I had a very, very nice Thanksgiving. I don't know if you know this, but my husband and I moved to El Paso, so we are a little bit closer to our family. So we got to spend Thanksgiving with my mom and my grandma, and it was really nice. I will say that we always have this Thanksgiving tradition that we've been doing for a long time. And what we do is on Thanksgiving, we buy the newspaper that has all the ads, all the, hundreds of ads for Black Friday shopping. And we get those ads and we each take a different colored Sharpie and we circle things that we want. Of course, it doesn't really mean anything because, at the end of the day, we end up throwing the paper away. So nobody really sees what you circled, but it's just a fun time together and it's something that we do. And this year we got the paper and there was a huge disappointment. There was only just a handful of ads in there. I guess everything is going online now, so they're not really putting it in the paper, which is understandable. It's cheaper, but it kind of ruined our tradition. So we still looked at the ads, but it wasn't nearly as fun, and it didn't nearly take as long as it usually does. But it was still nice. We got to be together. But what are some of your Thanksgiving traditions? Let me know. Reply on Facebook or send me a message, or just curious to know if anybody out there has different Thanksgiving or Christmas traditions that you do that are unique from everybody else. So I want to mention about the foundation, the Pre to Post Transplant Foundation. I'm excited because we're growing. We are going to be starting some new programs. And I'm excited for how far we've come. So if you want to learn more about the foundation and find out how you can help, then visit the website at www.pretopost.org, and you can find out the great things that we're doing. Also, if you want to log on to the website for the podcast, then you can find every episode. And you can find out how you can contact me if you want to be on the show, or if you have a comment or suggestion, you can get onto the website and leave a message. The website to the podcast is www.pretoposttx.com. So let's talk about my guest today. Mandy is a friend of mine who I've met when I was living in Houston, and she is a heart transplant recipient. And my gosh, when you listen to her story, she has been through so much. Her poor heart went through so much before she finally got her transplant, and her story is very inspirational. So when you listen to it, I hope that you enjoy it. And if you want to leave a comment about the episode or want to send a message to Mandy or any of my guests, then of course, log on to the website and you can do that. So with that, let's go ahead and listen to the episode. I know you're going to love this episode with my friend, Mandy Nathan. Hi, Mandy. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Jenny. I'm happy to be here.
I'm happy that you're here too. So tell me first where you got your transplant, when you got your transplant, and why you needed one.
Okay. I got my transplant at Houston Methodist Hospital on November 10, 2019. And I needed it because although I did not discover this until less than a year before I got my transplant, I had a genetic uh, disease that affects the heart, among other things. And I was having terrible symptoms from that.
What was the disease?
It's one of those letter and number things. It's
Oh,
very rare.
okay. It's a bunch of letters, a bunch of numbers.
Yes,
That's fine.
exactly.
So tell me about like the symptoms you were having and stuff. Because you said that it was within a year that you got a transplant after
Well,
symptoms.
no, no.
Oh,
It was less than a year that we discovered that all of my symptoms were from this genetic
oh,
defect.
okay.
No, my symptoms actually began pretty innocuously when I was only 22 years old. I just was at the doctor for something little, and the doctor kind of paused as he was listening to my heart, and he said, "Well, that's interesting. Do you mind if I invite some other doctors into the room to listen to this?" And he dragged in four little interns who all listened to my heart. So it turned out I had supraventricular tachycardia, which is a big deal. It just means you have a very fast heartbeat. So, I kind of, put that in the back of my mind. I didn't need to do anything for it or take anything for it. Just kind of went about my life. Um, and everything was fine until it turned into AFib when I was about probably 38 or 39.
Oh, okay.
And so I got on, a blood thinner, and everything was fine with that. And I was on that for years. And eventually my doctor actually let me get off of it. Um, and then in 2013, I had a TIA, or a mini stroke. And it was a quite serious one. I still have the blood, a little blood spot in my
Really?
brain,
Wow.
which made the transplant surgeons very reluctant to even put me on the list, because they were afraid that with all the blood thinners I was going to have to take for the transplant, it would break loose. Um, and that was a strange thing, because I was really not expecting it, and I didn't know what it was. It actually happened while I was asleep in bed, and I rolled over and I couldn't move my right arm or my right leg, and I kind of thought, that's funny. Are they both asleep? And I kind of wrestled with it briefly. Um, and I thought, well, I'll just go back to sleep and it'll be fine in the morning. Unfortunately, when I woke up in the morning, I could move fine, but I could tell my brain was not working right. Like, I would
Mm.
be thinking things, but I couldn't like get the words out.
Yeah.
So, long story short, I ended up going to my cardiologist sent me to a neurologist. Um, and he said did a CT and confirmed that I had had a mini stroke. So I got on one of the newer generation blood thinners at that point. Um, and things kind of went fine for a while.
Well,
Uh,
how were you feeling at that point? Like, because you already had this other issue with your heart and you're thinking about transplant, but now you have this new stroke thing. What was
well, I
going
mean,
on?
at the time, I wasn't thinking about before that. All I had was SVT. So
Oh, oh,
I that this kind of freaked me out. But I was told with the blood thinners, especially the new generation ones, are pretty good at preventing AFib from causing stroke. So I
oh,
felt
okay.
pretty good. But it is kind of nerve wracking, because even SVT is not super common among people who are that young. Um,
And
and
so was your body recovering? Like, because your arm was numb and you said you
yeah,
made a motion
yeah.
on your
As I
face.
said, the physical manifestations really were gone by morning, but
Oh, okay.
the mental part of it lasted probably 3 months. And I mean, I could talk, but it was a very odd thing.
Yeah.
And so it was concerning. I mean, the day that it happened, I actually tried to go to work, and I'm an attorney. And I was trying to write a brief, and I literally could not figure out what I was trying to do.
Yeah.
Um, but that severe part went away fairly quickly.
Okay.
And so kind of life went on until the end of 2014 when I started feeling horrible. I was easily tired. I was just always exhausted from any energy. I was short of breath. I was coughing horribly. I was having to sleep sitting up in a chair, and I was having difficulty swallowing. And heart failure wasn't even on my radar screen. I mean, I was looking out for strokes, not for heart failure.
Yeah.
And so my mother-in-law actually suggested that I go see a gastroenterologist about my swallowing problem. And he did a scan on me, and he said, "You can't swallow because your heart is so enlarged, it's blocking your esophagus. You need to go see your cardiologist."
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. So fortunately, I had either, I don't know, once or twice a year appointments with my cardiologist anyway. So I happened to have an appointment with him about 2 weeks later. Um, so he confirmed I did have heart failure and my heart was enlarged. So he sent me to, in addition to putting me on, a bunch of heart failure pills to hopefully relieve all those horrible symptoms, sent me to an electrophysiologist, an EP, who put an internal implantable cardioverter defibrillator in my chest, which you may know is like a little small flip phone sized device that goes into your heart, and it will shock you out of any potentially fatal ventricular tachycardia, hopefully.
Oh. Oh.
So that was fine. But
Is
then
that
6 weeks.
is that a different thing than a pacemaker?
Yes, it has a
Okay.
pacemaker in it. A pacemaker, just if your heart starts beating too slowly or too fast, it paces you back into it.
Oh, right.
The
Yeah.
cardio defibrillator is like the paddles, but
Yeah.
it's inside your chest.
Yeesh.
So it's something that you hopefully will never experience. It's nice to know it's there, but you don't ever want to actually get shocked.
Yeah. Did you ever have to get shocked by that?
I did. I
Oh
did,
no.
as a matter of fact. Yes. Yes.
Wow. I'm curious
Um,
to what that felt like. Like,
it there's not it's not like a shock, like an electrical shock. It feels like a horse has kicked you in the chest.
oh,
And sometimes you're conscious for them, and sometimes you're not. And I had both ways. Um, but yeah, it's
yeah.
it's not fun. It's not fun.
Yeah. Eeh.
Yeah.
Okay.
So after I got my ICD, everything was fine for about 6 weeks, but then I had another mini stroke. My vision, I was seeing like off kilter double vision. Um, so I went to the hospital, and by this point, I had my regular cardiologist, I had my neurologist, and I had my EP, and so they were all in my room, and they came to the consensus that it was probably because they had to take me off my blood thinner to put in my ICD, and so they thought I must have just a clot had formed
Yeah.
then, and it had broken off 6 weeks later, and had caused that. So I,
Yeah.
after 3 days in the hospital, I went home, fairly assured that that was a one-time thing. And then I had another one about 3 weeks later, again, vision related, back in the hospital. More discussion among the doctors, and they did not agree. And unfortunately, they did not agree in my presence, which made me very nervous.
Yeah.
But anyway, my EP decided I needed to change my blood thinner, so they actually put me back on warfarin
Hmm.
off of the new generation one. So again, I was extremely nervous because every time you have a mini stroke, it increases the chances that you're going to have a real stroke.
Yeah.
So I kind of felt like I was on borrowed time at this
Yeah.
point. But things went okay for really a couple of years, and I kind of lived my life, went on a big cruise with my sons for their graduations, and kind of was doing okay. But then in the fall of 2018, things really started falling apart. First, I had another mini stroke, again, vision related, which, you know, earned me another trip to the hospital.
Yeah.
And a visit. They said because all of these latest ones were mostly vision related, they sent me to a neuro ophthalmologist who terrified me because she said,
Yeah.
I mean, she was literally yelling at me. You're lucky that you haven't had a real stroke yet. They need to keep you in the hospital until they can get this AFib under control. She actually picked out her cell phone and dialed one of my doctors. I don't
Oh
know
my
which one.
gosh.
Fortunately, he was not there, so he did not pick up. But, you know, by this time, I was pretty nervous.
Yeah, I
I
bet.
also, in October, developed a blood clot in my arm, and you know had to go see a who would that have been? I don't know. Whoever you go see about blood clots in arms. And you know, I just wanted him to like get it out, you know, give me one of those clot busting drugs. And
Yeah.
I was just like, you know, everything else I could at least hide inside me. But I mean, this I had huge visible veins like
Oh,
starting
really?
in
Wow.
my arm, and they're still there all over the left side of my chest, and my arm was swollen. And I just needed it to be gone. So I didn't
Yeah.
think about it every time I saw it. But he was like, you know, it's really more risky to do that. I'll do it if you really want me. I mean, because I was crying at this point. He said, I'll do it if you want, but I really recommend against it. And, you know, so that was another thing. And then unfortunately, my heart failure was awful at this point, too.
Yeah.
I remember telling my EP, I remember saying, I feel like I'm dying. And
Yeah.
which prompted him, fortunately, to send me to his office mate, who was a transplant cardiologist at St. Luke's, who, you know, juggled set up some of my medication, and he's the one who did the genetic testing. And, you know, my regular cardiologist had done the standard genetic testing, but he really felt like it had to be genetic. So he
Yeah.
ran, you know, every test in the world, and you know, it came back like 6 weeks later, and it confirmed that I did have this genetic defect that can cause heart arrhythmias and/or heart failure. And unfortunately, I got both. And the odd thing is, nobody on either side of my family has ever had heart problems.
Wow.
So it was, you know, a complete surprise. I to this day I don't know which side of the
Yeah.
family it came from. Um, so you know, I knew that now, but you know, it didn't really do me any good to know that. I mean, it answered the question of why, but it didn't, you
Yeah.
know,
Didn't
didn't
fix the
provide,
problem. Right.
didn't, yeah, exactly. Um, and so then in February of 2019, I started having VTACs. The first one, I was home alone and I was laying on the couch. And it's like, you know how in cartoons sometimes when they show the character's vision and it just like starts big and then it gets black and it goes
Yeah.
to a little circle in the middle?
Uh-huh.
That's what it was like. I felt all of a sudden, I remember thinking, gosh, I'm really tired all of a sudden. And then I was just out. And I woke up and I was like, I mean, I only had a split second to think that was really weird what just happened. And then I felt a shock. So it turned out my heart had gone into VTAC and it had rendered me unconscious because in VTAC, um, the heart is beating so fast that the heart doesn't have time to fill with blood before it pumps again. So it, you know, it doesn't get enough oxygen to the rest of your body.
Right.
So while I was asleep, I apparently got shocked once, and it shocked me out of it, and that's when I returned to consciousness. But then it slipped back in, so I got shocked again. Um, so you know, off I went to the hospital again,
Wow.
um, and they put me on one antiarrhythmic drug, Um, and my EP warned me at the time, I'm going to put you on this one. And if this doesn't work, we're going to have to put you on another one. And you're not going to like that one. And I'm not even going to tell you what it's called because I don't want you to go home and Google it. So I went home, and the next month I had another couple VTAC episodes. This time I was awake for the first one, and then I went unconscious, and I had another one while I was asleep.
At this point, were you like at a point where you were afraid to drive or you were afraid to, like, you couldn't work anymore?
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
After this visit, the one in March, he said, okay, you're going to have to stop driving. And I stopped going to work. And I hadn't intended to stop going to work then. Actually, I'm not sure I did. I think between the February VTAC and the March VTAC, I think I did return to work after a couple weeks. But I was having to Uber to the office every day, which was,
Yeah.
um, and I intended to do the same thing after this March one. Um, but unfortunately, then I ended up in the hospital again in April. But by this time, I mean, well, when I was in the hospital in March, my transplant cardiologist at that point said, well, my heart failure cardiologist said for the first time, I think we need to start getting you on the list for the heart transplant. And I had asked my regular cardiologist, I feel like maybe a year and a half ago or before that, um, am I looking at a transplant down the road? Because I just didn't see how that was not what was in my future.
Yeah.
And he said, we don't need to think about that right now. It's my job to try to keep that from happening, and it's not something we need to discuss
Yeah.
now. But now my heart failure guys, said, okay, we need to start getting you on the list. Um, so there was a little bit of complication because they weren't sure whether I was going to have it at that hospital or move over to Methodist. And while that was being resolved, um, I ended up in the hospital again, this time from internal bleeding, because I was having to go to the hospital twice a week to get my INR level tested, which is something you have to do when you're on blood thinners or when you're on warfarin
Hmm.
specifically, not on the newfangled ones.
Yeah.
And I had been on Friday and they were fine. And by Sunday, they were so bad that I just started bleeding internal.
Wow. Wow.
Um, so back in the hospital.
Well, how did you know that? Like, how could you tell?
I was very nauseous. I was very tired, exhausted, and my stool was black,
Oh,
which, is
yeah.
always the telltale sign.
Right.
Um, so at that point, um, the decision was made that I would go to Methodist. And so fortunately, Methodist got me in very quickly for my first visit. Um, and they said, yes, we think you are probably going to be a candidate. Let's start doing your evaluation. And the first step in a heart transplant evaluation, as you know, is the right heart cath, so they can assess the condition of your heart. I was really leaning on them to let me do them all on an inpatient basis because there's so many tests, and I just knew that making one appointment at a time was going to take weeks, if not months, and I really was not sure I had weeks or months that I could wait. I
Yeah.
felt like I was constantly on the verge of either a full-blown stroke or more VTACs, from which my ICD would not save me because it doesn't always work.
Yeah.
Um, and he kind of resisted. He said, I don't know, being in the hospital unnecessarily, you're exposed to germs, and insurance companies don't like to pay for it, and yada yada. So I went in to do it, and for better or for worse, while I was in the recovery room, I had another string of VTACs. and I did not get shocked, but when you're there, you're hooked up to the machines, and so a really loud alarm went off, and 10 people come running in with the paddles. I was like, no, 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 I don't need the paddles. It came with my own, thanks. So yeah, so that earned me a an inpatient hospital
Yeah.
evaluation. Um,
That's like the only time you were grateful for that to happen, right?
yes,
Yeah.
exactly, exactly. So that took. I was probably there for about 2.5 weeks. Um, Mostly because I mean, the test you have to do. I mean, you got to do the right hard cath, an MVO stress test. You got to do CTs of your chest and head, ECG and EKG, carotid, pelvic, and renal ultrasounds, a mammogram and a pap smear,
Yeah.
x-rays, colonoscopy, blood test.
Yeah.
The list is just never ending. And the colonoscopy is actually what held me up because they can't do it until you're off your blood thinner and they get you
Oh,
hooked up
yeah.
to heparin. And it took them a really long time to both get me down to the appropriate level that they were willing to do it and then get me back up so that they were comfortable sending me home again. But the bad news that came out of that hospital stay was that it turns out I have very high anti-HLA antibodies, which which are very interesting little things. And the only point relevant that people need to know is most people don't have any, but
Yeah.
if you have them and you need a transplant, they're very bad because it greatly limits the number of people from which you can receive a heart because your antibodies will attack their hearts.
Yeah.
Um, so at the time, it was actually a fellow who told me that because even after I had done my colonoscopy, while I was just waiting for my blood to sufficiently thicken back up, um, I knew I hadn't gotten those results back, and frankly, I wasn't worried about them because when I had to do when I went in for the internal bleeding, they had to give me 2 transfusions, and I was like panicked about it because transfusions are one thing that can increase your antibodies, and I knew that I didn't want them, and I had actually asked my heart failure cardiologist about that before he sent me over to Methodist, and he said, "Oh, I'm not worried about that at all." And so I wasn't worried about it. And then I'm laying there in my bed at Methodist, and a fellow comes in advance of the transplant cardiologist as usual. And I said, "By the way, have we gotten my antibody results back?" And he was like standing behind me looking at my machine, and he kind of mumbled, "Oh yeah, you're at 95%, I think." And I thought to myself, wait, have I got the numbers wrong? Does that mean I can receive hearts from 95%? And I said, 95? I said, so that 95% of people I can receive it from or can't? And he said, can't. He said, and then he realized his mistake and he said, let's wait until doctor, I forget which doctor it was, until he gets here. And he like made a beeline for the door.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, so there's actually 2 antibody levels that they look at, and one of mine was 95 and the other was 98. Um, so I was devastated because I thought, well, that's just hopeless by the time you multiply that by
Yeah.
body size and blood type and all the other matches that have to work, and given the limited time that I felt like I had, because I mean I had been told at my evaluation meeting, initially that my heart was in stage 4 heart failure and that most people in heart failure at that stage live about a year. So I I was devastated.
I bet. Yeah.
And so we talked about it, and they said, we transplanted another woman um, last year who was at 95%. Don't worry about it. We'll figure it out. Yada, yada. And so they said, okay, so we're going to discharge you now. And I was like, what do you mean you're going to discharge me? I'm going to go home and have another VTAC. And they said, well, we can't keep you here. We're going to try and get you on the list. And, we'll contact you as soon as that happens. And so I went home, and 6 days later, I had another VTAC and got shocked again. And this time I went to the hospital and I did not leave, and that was on May 22nd. And as I
Oh,
said, I
wow.
had my heart transplant on November 10th. So that
Wow. Yeah,
tells
that's
you
a
how
long
long
time.
I waited. Um, so, they admitted me, but then they told me that they really weren't sure that I should stay at Methodist and that they were going to be willing to list me because of my antibody issues. Um, they encouraged me to think about transferring out to Cedars-Sinai in Los Angeles because they highly sensitized patients, which is what they call patients who have high antibodies, are kind of Cedars-Sinai's bailiwick. They handle a lot of patients who have it. They successfully get a lot of them transplanted, and Methodist encouraged me then and several times during the following 6 months to, think about whether I wanted to go there instead. Um, their immunology board was supposed to be meeting and was going to discuss whether they thought Methodist should list me.
Mhm.
Um, so fortunately, they decided to go ahead and have me stay at least long enough to undergo the treatments that they usually have patients undertake to try to reduce antibodies. And there's three standard components to that protocol that all hospitals use in varying combinations and quantities. Um, the first one is called a plasmapheresis, which
Yeah.
is it's basically like a dialysis machine, except it cycles out all of your blood and removes the plasma, which is where the antibodies are, and then sends it back in.
Hmm.
So I did 5 of those, and they made me horribly nauseous, um, which was not pleasant.
Yeah.
Um, the the second component is they're called IVIGs, intravenous immunoglobulin, and they're basically IVs that give you donated plasma from other people.
Yeah.
So, when they ask you when you donate blood, would you like to donate plasma too? You kind of do the reverse of what I did. They take out your plasma, but it's so they can give it to people like me. And then the third component, and this component varied a little because I had to do these protocols 3 times. Sometimes I got antibody therapy, and sometimes I got chemotherapy. So I did 5 plasmapheresis treatments, I think 4 IVIGs and 1 IV of the antibody therapy. Um, and while I was doing all those, my team was deciding whether to put me on an intra-aortic balloon pump, which is like the pump part is like a little machine that looks like R2D2, except it's got a laptop for a hat, and it's connected through a catheter to a balloon that's inserted in your heart.
Okay.
And so the machine pumps and it inserts the balloon, and the idea is it helps your heart pump more efficiently. So I desperately wanted that, not
Yeah.
because you only get it if your heart is bad enough, but because when you have a balloon pump, you're automatically upgraded to a level 2 on the national transplant list.
Oh, okay.
So, you know, and they said they would determine whether my heart was bad enough for it by a second right heart cath. So, ironically, me and everybody who knows me were hoping that my heart had had deteriorated or at least not improved any over the last 4 weeks. So, fortunately, while they were deciding that, they did decide to list me, so that was a huge relief. And they ultimately decided to give me the balloon pump.
Wow.
Yeah. So
I bet that was a big relief whenever they
that
told you that way you wouldn't have to go to LA.
yes,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah. And the problem was, I mean, I knew I was going to be in the hospital for a really long time.
Yeah.
And the idea of doing it in LA, where I have a cousin that lives there, but nobody was going to be able to visit me regularly there. I was just going to be in a hospital room by myself, for who knows how long, which is
Yeah.
really the problem with waiting for a heart transplant is you don't know if and when it's ever going to come.
Yeah.
So yes, although as I said, they did to jump ahead a little bit, these protocols didn't work, and so they every now and then they would again throw out, do you want us to see if we can get you into Cedars-Sinai? I mean, they had literally sent all of my paperwork to them, when they admitted me that last time. Um, so um, so unfortunately, they gave me the pump, which is. Did you have a pump?
No, I had lung transplant.
Oh, that's right. I forgot that.
Yeah.
Um, so the pump itself, well, it did make me feel better. I mean, I did have more energy with it, and it did get me to level 2, but it's very limiting because you're hooked up to it, and it's hooked up to machines in your room, and you've got a 6-foot catheter from the pump to you, and that's all you can move.
Yeah.
I could walk in the hallways, but a nurse had to walk with me, and it took them literally 15 to 20 minutes every time to come in and disconnect everything and get it ready to be mobile. And then we had to walk down the hall with me pushing the pump and them pushing the IV pole onto which my heart monitor was attached. And then when we were done, we had to come back and they had to spend another
Oh my.
15 to 20 minutes, getting it all hooked back up. So I really underestimated the limitations that it would bring. It was also very loud. I mean, it was literally a pump, and it made a loud pumping sound every time it pumped, and it had a very sensitive alarm
Mm-hmm.
um, that went off, you know, at least 10 times a day, and a
Yeah.
lot at night, because you have to sleep laying completely flat on your back. And if you move the wrong way, it goes off. And
Yeah.
I mean, I could hear alarms, from people down the hallway from me because they want a nurse to come running when they hear it. So the pump took some getting used to. I got a brief respite from it because the day after I had it implanted, they I started having pain in my arm, and then ultimately I couldn't even raise my forearm. So I had a blood clot had
Oh my.
formed, um, and so they had to take it out, um, and excavate the blood clot. Um, and there was great discussion about whether they were going to be able to put it back in, which terrified me.
Yeah.
Because they couldn't put it back in on that side. A lot of people have these pumps inserted through their groin. And in fact, Methodist Hospital actually pioneered having them inserted peripherally, as they say. It was basically under the collarbone, right above my heart. And they do it so patients can be active, so they can walk.
Yeah.
But there were patients at Methodist who, for one reason or another, had to have it in their groin, and they had to lay in bed the entire time they were there, head
Wow.
not above 45 degrees. Um,
That sounds miserable. I mean, you already don't feel good and you already have to like go through
yeah,
this and the pump, you can't hardly move around.
yeah,
And having it in the groin, I can't, that would probably be even worse. My
yeah,
goodness.
yes. Yeah, I can't imagine. And as I said, Methodist pioneered that. A lot of hospitals don't do it. Um, I mean, a lot of hospitals don't have the balloon pumps at all, but most of them insist that you put it in the groin if you're going to have one.
Yeah.
But they eventually decided they would give me another one, and they put it in on the other side of my chest, um, which made it a little difficult just because of the distance. So they had to go in and put, basically shore it up. Um, I kept getting a hematomas over where my original pump had been. So, I had surgery that day to move my pump. And then over the next month, I had two more surgeries um, because the hematomas kept coming back. So, I kept having to be intubated and anesthetized. And, one time I woke up with my breathing tube still in, and that is not an experience that anybody should ever have to go through. So everybody avoid that at all costs if you can.
Yeah,
Um,
I had that when I had my transplant. I woke up, still had the breathing tube in.
yeah, mine was
Wasn't
out
fun.
after my transplant, but yeah, yeah. Um, so okay, so I got my balloon pump. Got my hematomas scraped out a couple more times. Um, but then I got the news that my first protocol had not reduced my antibodies at all. Um, so they decided to do it again. Um, so the whole routine again. This time, as I mentioned, the plasmapheresis made me very sick. Um, and they were giving me, I forget, Finnergan, some
Yeah.
anti-nausea medicine,
Anti-nausea.
and it always knocked me out. Eventually, I mean, after the plasmapheresis was over, and it usually lasted around an hour, I would just sleep. After the fourth one, while I was asleep, my blood pressure dropped to 60 over 40, and I was literally unconscious. Like they apparently had people come in and do an ultrasound
Wow.
on me, and I remember none of it. And finally, after 4 hours, my nurse woke me up. She said, "We just need to make sure that you're okay." And I was like, "What are you talking about?" So I did not have to do my fifth plasmapheresis. So did all of those components again, and then got the terrible news that neither of those had been successful either. And it turned out, I mean, my numbers were actually going the wrong way. I was now up to 98 or 99%. Um, and so, they really weren't sure what to do with me. Um, so one of the doctors, who's like kind of the big research guy, just hit the books, and he found an experimental protocol that had been successful on exactly one person in France, a guy.
Oh my gosh.
So they decided that they were going to do that for me. Um, and basically it would involve some of all of the old components, except I think this is when they switched a little one dose chemotherapy for the antibody therapy, and then 8 once a week doses of a relatively new multiple myeloma chemotherapy called oh my gosh, I can't believe I can't remember it now. Can't remember the name of it.
You'll think
It'll
of
come
it
to
when we're
me
done. Yeah.
eventually. Yeah.
When as soon as we get done, you're gonna remember.
Yeah, yeah. Um, anyway, so the old components were again not fun, especially the plasmapheresis. I don't think they made me do 5 again this time. And then I started the weekly ones. Um, and they took a blood draw, I think after just the first week, which, they don't come back quickly,
Yeah.
unless the doctors really, really weigh on the lab people. Um, and eventually, when it came back, it showed that my numbers hadn't gone down at all yet. They were, in fact, they were at 99%. And, by this time, I was pretty hopeless. I mean, I always
Yeah.
put on a good face with people.
Yeah.
And it's important to keep a positive attitude, and I did, but at some point you
Yeah.
realize, this isn't really gonna probably work out. Um, so, I mean, I had actually already by this point written my my celebration of life service,
Yeah.
written the factual part of my obituary. I had contacted a friend of mine that I grew up with in Galveston who was a minister in the area, and asked her if she'd do my funeral.
Wow.
Um, so yeah. Oh, and I had written letters to my husband, my parents, and my sons. So
Wow. That's I can't even
yeah,
imagine having to like think about those things. Like you're
yeah,
like have so much hope and then you're like, I've got to take care of this.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And I mean, I didn't, you know, I was also thinking, okay, well, so this doesn't work. Or how long is Methodist going to let me just sit around this hospital knowing that I have almost no chance of getting a heart? And how long is my insurance company going to pay for me to sit around this hospital, um, this entire time? And, do I need to think about getting an LVAD, which is it's basically like a mechanical heart that cardiologists can implant in people, either as a bridge to transplant if your heart is really bad but you don't really need a transplant yet, or as it's called a destinational treatment. If you don't qualify or you're never going to get a transplant, they give you one sometimes, which is obviously presumably what I would have been. um, and one of my doctors had actually mentioned that, um, but I had gone into Methodist with my old cardiologist telling me, whatever happens, don't let them put an LVAD in you. And I had been told, and it was because, as I had been told at Methodist, people who have a history of arrhythmias, AFibs, and VTACs are, quote, very poor candidates for LVADs because LVADs themselves can cause arrhythmias.
Oh,
So I was looking at, risking stroke and VTAC and,
yeah.
ending up, potentially hospitalized or institutionalized. There's a lot of bad things floating around in my head. um, but I finished out the 8 treatments, and then um, so my final one was supposed to be on Friday, the 8th of November, and I woke up with a little bit of a fever, apparently, which you never want when you're waiting for a transplant, because if
Right.
you're sick, you don't get a transplant. Even if your perfect heart comes in, you
Yeah.
don't get it. So they postponed my final treatment, um, and supposedly until Monday. And then Saturday morning, and nothing happens
Right.
in the hospital on a Saturday unless you cause an emergency.
Hmm.
So, but my transplant cardiologist that day said, "Hey, your fever's gone, so we're going to go ahead and have them do your infusion." Um, it's an ordeal, by the way. This infusion was like an 8-hour infusion.
Oh, wow.
Um, so I did it. Um, and I didn't think much of it at the time, but then that night in bed at like 11:30, my nurse came in and said, "Dr. Trachtenberg's on the phone, and he says he wants to talk about an offer with you." And she said he's going to call you on your room phone. And my mind was spinning as like, an offer. And so he called and said they had been working on it all day. So, clearly that was why they gave me the final treatment. Um, So all he said was, he said it's a young woman from another state, and I've since learned she was in Oklahoma. And he said she did have some physical issues, which he described to me. And I think probably the reason she fell to me, because she was like almost outside of the 500-mile radius. I'm sure there were people closer to her who probably turned down her offer. But he said that antibody wise, she was a completely perfect match, which was just incredible.
Oh,
Um, and so, so he said, he explained everything. He said, okay, well, we need you to consent. And I said, well, you've got it. And so my transplant took place the next morning around, I think they took me down at 10, because the transplant, all of the transplant doctors who are going to retrieve organs from this particular donor all obviously have to descend at the hospital at the same time. So it was scheduled, I think, for 9 o'clock the next morning. So one of the transplant surgeons flew up, and after the longest night of my life.
yeah. I was gonna say, how was that night? You
Yeah,
probably didn't
well,
get any sleep.
a lot of it was, they did blood work out the wazoo, and lots of paperwork, and lots of, the anesthesiologists come in, and the pulmonologists come in, and the transplant doctors come in. Everybody's getting all their consents and disclosures and everything. But yeah, it was nerve wracking. But then eventually my nurse came in and gave us all, my family was there. And let's see, also the chaplain at Methodist, who had, been wonderful. Um, she came in and gave us all the thumbs up, and they took me down about an hour later, and got my transplant. I think the surgery itself, I think, only lasted about 6 hours. Um, yeah,
Wow.
ta-da.
Yeah. That's got to be the most amazing feeling after you've already started coming to terms with, I'm probably not going to make it. I've got to figure out, what I'm going to do, and kind of, I don't want to say lost hope, but you kind of you lost a little bit of hope there. And
Yeah,
so to get that call after all that's already going through your mind has to be just the most amazing feeling in the world.
yeah, it was. Yeah, absolutely amazing. One of my transplant cardiologists actually told me, when I was when I'd been moved to the CVICU eventually, that my chances of receiving a perfect heart like that were 5.7 million to 1.
Oh, that's great. That's
Yeah,
amazing. That's so awesome.
yeah, yeah.
That's so great. So how did the recovery go? I'm sure piece of cake compared to what you had been through beforehand.
You would think so, but
Oh shoot.
no,
Oh no.
no. The first 5 days were fine. I mean, I don't, I assume that they get you up pretty quickly after a lung transplant too. But at Methodist, when you're a heart transplant, they have you standing up the next day. And
Yeah.
after 5 days, I had walked around the entire floor. But I could tell those last couple days something didn't feel right. And I had my surgery, like I said, on a Sunday, and by Friday morning, I was still really, really swollen, which isn't unusual, but I just felt like I was too swollen. Not that I had anything to judge by. And it it took an effort even to raise my head. And so my transplant cardiologist came in, and I talked to her about it. And she clearly had something she was working on. Um, and so they said, okay, well, we're going to take you down to the cath lab. And in retrospect, it turned out she was concerned that I had SVC syndrome. Um, which is when your superior vena cava gets blocked, in my case, by blood clots. And so blood can't get out of the upper part of your body. So that's the
Yeah.
blood that comes from your head and your arms, which explains why my face was so swollen, why it was hard to raise it, why my arms were so swollen. So they took me down there and they, she did something and then some other doctor did something, whoever does veins, I guess. And I think I was kind of out. I always asked to be knocked out, even when I just went to the cath lab, because I had such problems going to sleep at night just because of all the horrible things that were racing around in my head. I just like really loved being able to just be unconscious for a while.
Yeah.
So I think I was out of it, but then I woke up by the time I got back to my room, and the doctor came in and said, "You have SVC syndrome. We're going to have to do surgery." And I said, "Okay, when?" And she said, "Right now."
Oh my
So I
God.
had another emergency surgery. Um, I the people my emergencies always happened on the weekends. Like I said, I had two more evacuations of my hematoma over here before I got my transplant, and also the balloon in my pump had ruptured twice, which isn't unusual. They're balloons; they're supposed to pop. But mine, both happened on the weekend, and they both happened after I had had an illegal snack. The first time one of the nurses had snuck me in a piece of chocolate cake. So, when the anesthesiologist comes in and said, "When was the last time you had anything to eat?" I had to say, "Well, I had a piece of chocolate cake." The bad thing was too, because my pump was going in from the other side, they had to intubate and anesthetize me for both of those too. So,
Yeah.
by that time I was really tired of the pump. Um, so anyway, went down, had the SVC syndrome taken care of. And then a couple days later, they had to do another evacuation of my hematoma. And something else happened too, and I had to be anesthetized for it. And so by the combination of my transplant and those two additional anesthetizations, I was just completely out of it. Like there are 5 days that I have no memory of at all. And I was talking in my sleep. I woke up once and I was sure that I saw trees outside my window and I was on the ninth floor. I woke up once. I thought I was on the conveyor belt of the grocery store. And I did it. And I thought, I'm on a conveyor belt in the grocery store. And I just went back to sleep. And one time my doctor was in talking to me and I was just so sleepy and I thought I have got to listen to him. And I was trying really hard, but then I fell asleep while he was talking to me and I could like hear him droning on, but I was like dreaming about something with a dog. And I could tell from the inflection of his voice all of a sudden that he asked me a question. And I said, "Okay, but the dog isn't going to like that." And he said, "What?" And like my eyes flew open and I realized, oh, wait, that wasn't appropriate for that. So yeah, so I got through those and then I started having trouble breathing and I either had pneumonia or some lung infection. So I had to do all the breathing treatments and all of that. So, I mean, I didn't get out of the hospital for about 5 weeks, I don't think.
Oh wow.
But it was just in time for Christmas. So
Yeah.
so that was great.
And so it's been almost 3 years. So how have you, since you got out, how have you been doing and how are you doing now?
Really good. My biggest problem, well, I had, people who have transplants sometimes have weird thyroid side effects. And I did have that. I had to see an endocrinologist about that for a while, and that went away. And I had to do getting transplants also makes your blood sugar get off whack. So I was still having to poke myself every 3 hour, or 3 times a day when I got home, but that went by the wayside. The only problem that I had, two problems I had continuing were um, my immune system was especially bad. I mean, all transplant patients have bad immune systems.
Right.
But my white blood count and my percentage of neutrophils were crazy low. Like if you Google them, they will say that I can get infections just from, mouth bacteria.
Yeah.
And so I saw a hematologist for probably about a year and a half about that. And I was having to give myself shots of, there's various iterations of it, but it's a medicine that raises your white blood count for, in theory, a week. Unfortunately, my cardiology team did not like that because it also increases your risk of rejection. So there was a little
Yeah.
headbutting about that. But then, like 4 months ago, all of a sudden, my numbers just improved. So,
Okay.
for a regular person, I'm still on the low scale, but for a transplant patient, I'm a-okay
Yeah.
there. Um, and then I uh, I have osteoporosis and osteopenia because with my weekly chemotherapy doses, they had to give me huge doses of steroids every
Yeah.
week. And then after the transplant, of course, they also give you huge doses of transplants, and I have to take a 5 milligrams of a steroid on an ongoing basis for immunosuppressive purposes. So I actually fractured my back while I was in the hospital doing. I had turned in my bed to pull out the little under tray so the food
Mm.
service person could put it on, and
Right.
just that did it.
Wow.
And so that was very painful for quite a while, and it eventually went away, and then it came back earlier this year. So I've been going to PT for, well, 5 months.
That's probably going to be an ongoing battle for you,
Yeah,
unfortunately.
yeah, yeah. But heart wise, everything has been great. I haven't had any problems at all.
That's fantastic. Yeah, that's great. Well, so my last question is, and I ask all my recipients this, or really everybody, if you could give a piece of advice to somebody who is pre transplant, kind of going through the same thing that you went through, what would that be? Or that you wish that you had known, what would that be?
I wish I had known. It's interesting. I actually didn't want to know. Like a friend of ours, a friend of many friends of ours had a heart transplant at Methodist literally less than a year before I did. And everybody was like, you need to talk to them, get together with them. And I was like, even when I was in the hospital, I was like, I'm not ready. I,
Yeah.
I don't want to know. And then, he did come, and it was wonderful to talk to him. Um, so, I mean, I don't really have anything that I wish I had known. I would just say, keep fighting,
Yeah.
you know, and things will get bad, but um, try to keep a positive attitude. That's the most important thing. I mean, there were days in the hospital when I just wanted to not get out of bed.
Yeah.
And I made myself get up and put on my mascara and sit in my chair and post on Caring Bridge and send texts. And I had people come in to see me every day. You've just gotta, there's two ways to go about this, and you gotta pick the right one.
Yeah, for sure. I always say that's so important, like for people suffering from depression, or if you're not feeling good all the time, you just got to get up and you got to make yourself get dressed, or like you said, put your mascara on. Like you've got to just get up and live, You
Yeah.
can't sit and dwell on it because it's just going to get worse if you do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I saw an article recently, and it's in Time magazine, and it's about someone who was in the Air Force. He apparently was Ross Perot's running mate whenever Ross Perot ran for president, and he had been a POW, and he said when he was there, his strategy wasn't to just like hope every day for a rescue. It was just to acknowledge, this is my situation. There's nothing I can do about it. I just have to get through it and keep the best attitude that I can.
Yeah.
And I think that's what I was doing. I didn't know that was a thing, but that's what you got to do. Yeah, I mean, as I said, bad things can happen. I thought there's a pretty good chance I was not gonna come out of there alive, but you acknowledge it and you say, okay, this is what I'm dealing with. How am I going to make my situation as good as it can be?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you for coming on and sharing your story. And
absolutely. Thank
really
you for asking me.
You're welcome. Okay, Mandy. Well, you have a great day, and I will see you soon. Stay healthy.
Thanks so much.
Thank you for listening to the Pre to Post Transplant Podcast. Please be sure to subscribe to the podcast and follow us on Facebook. Oh, and if you have not signed up to be an organ donor, please visit www.organdonor.gov and register today. You too can save lives.